Themes of aging, love, consequences, and even tampering with fate on some level. Oh gosh, I can never remember. Is it the Immortal Mortal or the Mortal Immortal? I can't remember the order.
The Mortal Immortal. Would you want to live forever?
You finally got your Mary Shelley request in. You've been asking me for years. Here we are at Halloween, and you said, we're doing this one for Halloween.
And it's really not even a horror story, right? I mean, unless the horrific part of living forever and seeing everyone that you've ever loved die is horrifying to you, then it's a horror story.
I think it is. Okay, well, I guess I took that as a really good horror story because, yeah, that sounds horrific to me. I don't know. Maybe that says more about me as a person because, let's put it this way. I'm over 40 now, right? Like, there's no like, oh, I just found a gray hair. My beard is littered with gray hair. That poor Winsy getting his first gray hair and then asking himself like, was it really gray? Was it just behind some other hairs and I never noticed it? Like, I'm like, oh, bro, no, it goes downhill from here real fast, just so you know.
I totally talked to my wife about this, because I always discuss the stories beforehand. And I said, I remember seeing like that first gray hair in my sideburn or somewhere in my beard. And I look back at our old videos and go, man, I've aged hard over the last 3 years. Like, I don't even care about gray hairs anymore. I just want to have a hair, like Winsy. Be happy you still have hair.
Well, they say, Winsy had the advantage in theory that he didn't go through COVID, because I've heard that COVID aged a lot of people's bodies. Like the people that sat around and didn't do anything sometimes for like months or a year, now working from home, not getting their steps in, that like the arthritis, the aches kick in, right? And to your point, we started this channel pre-COVID, right?
Yep.
We literally went through COVID. There was even one night we recorded, I had COVID as we were talking, right? And you look at those 4 years and you see how fast things have aged. At the time, I didn't notice, right? Like I'm like, oh, okay, I got some gray hairs. I noticed, like I wasn't like blind to it. But like when you and I did hey, let's look at some of our old videos and like make fun of them and scroll through them, you realize how fast it happens, right? And
yep.
Winsy has the opposite problem. Like he experiences a slow turn where he even like questions whether this is really happening. And I think that's interesting for him because, in the story, there's the love of his life, Bertha, when they're young. And she gets swept up by some governess, protectress, basically elevates a class. And poor Winsy realizes, like, even though, like, she doesn't act different, like, there's still a barrier between them, this wealth. So he needs a job. So he takes would it be fair to call it a monkey's paw? Like, did you get some religious references and insinuations from Cornelius, who was referenced several times to possibly be this Satan character who, after being around him and working with him for a year, Winsy didn't see any cloven hoofs. Like, what did you think about that element of the story exactly?
Yeah, Agrippa totally feels like the Satanist character luring him in to torment him because he knows what's going to happen and be like, oh, don't look at that over there, or don't eat this, or don't drink that. It might be bad. Like, he's totally luring in Winsy, and he falls for it because he's in love and he's young, he's reckless, and I think that's kind of the play to the story for me. Is there's this idea of youth and recklessness and old and being wise, and I think that we can only recognize that when you become old and wise. And Winsy jumps in, hook, line, and sinker, and he gets bamboozled here, and it's a tale. It's a cautionary tale, and Mary Shelley is telling us, hey, you've got to be careful of what you wish for because it might come true and you might not like it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. This kind of brings it down a notch. Like, I don't know, you can make fun of me if you want, but I always think about that Jurassic Park scene where Ian Malcolm's sitting there lecturing them saying, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could or couldn't, they never stopped to think, should they? Right. And Winsy just jumps into this miracle, this science, I guess, solution, as opposed to going through the pain, going and suffering through the experience of this thing called humanity, this thing called life, like loss, right? Like instead of just letting go of Bertha, he did try to work hard on it and such. He tries to go for that quick answer, right? And I think Mary Shelley on some level believes, because, when we compare this to Frankenstein's monster, you have consequences to those quick answers, those scientific shortcuts that some people might be taking. And I think it shortcuts, I think, that humanity, that suffering that I think even we're supposed to do if we're going to try to bring back in that religious thing. I think even in the third paragraph, they said something about the wandering Jew in all capitals. It's very clear that, let's say you were Jesus, or even Noah from back in the Genesis days, who lived, what was like 700 years around then or something like that. Like that is a long time to have to experience a lot of loss and to move through that. And to think about, like, if you were Jesus and you never had to like die if you didn't want to. I mean, I know that theoretically he came here for our sins and died for them. Imagine like having a perfect memory and having a perfect ability to recall loss and go through all that pain. Like it's almost like Shelley takes all of that negative that we sweep under the rug and injects it into Winsey with his careless decision to quickly try to forget love, which ends up making him half immortal.
There's a lot here, right? This story is very deep. You can take it from many different angles, and we could probably talk about this for an hour. Me, because, I'm the hopeless romantic, I go to love. You didn't see me going that way, did you?
Of course you do.
But, I mean, there's something to be said about, the vanity that is mentioned in the story. There's something to said about growth and maturity. To me, I look at it as Mary Shelley saying, what would we do for love? And Winsey is willing to sacrifice everything for love, but he doesn't know if it's true or not. And that's the problem is that he's not patient for it. That if you truly love something, you would be patient for it. And you wouldn't take the shortcut, as you mentioned. Because he takes the shortcut, and then he's in this peril situation. So in the story, he gets Agrippa's elixir, which gives him some sort of extended life, and he watches his wife die. And I think that a lot of us can relate to that. If that we see our loved ones, if you've ever lost a child, God forbid, that's like the worst experience. I don't have children, but I can only imagine from the people that I love in my life, and then I've told my wife, and I think you and I have talked about this off of camera, like, I got to go first, and I've told my wife that, like, I have to go first. I don't want to be here without you. And that is something that many people struggle with, of the loss of a loved one, the loved one. How do you deal with that? And I think that some people can't, but what if you're forced to? What if you have no choice? How do you deal with that? Is that something you want to deal with? And poor Winsey doesn't get a choice because of a reckless decision he made when he was young.
Or, like, if we go back to the monkey's paw, like, you were promised something, but it ends up being really twisted. The Faustian deal, right? Like, if you were viewing Agrippa Cornelius as this magic dealer, right, who's going to give us something, and I believe it was like, he'll cure me of love, of torture, I believe was the quote. Well, doesn't he, right? In theory, if you could live on forever, and that doesn't mean he's going to have a perfect memory. If he lived forever, couldn't he forget about Bertha at some point? Is it not impossible that even if you did experience pain, don't you move on for it at some point in your life, right? Like, I can't remember things that happened 5-10 years ago. Sometimes I might have one or two memories, very key things in my life, perhaps. But, like, theoretically, they say time heals all wounds. But is that true, right? If you really loved someone so deeply the way that Winsey did Bertha, don't we now have a conflict of the past and the ability to forget it? Right. And I think that's what Winsey is now experiencing, is that just because you're immortal doesn't mean you're immune to torture or loss.
And I think that brings up a good point. Is Winsey trustworthy? if we go into it, and maybe it's a little out of the realm because we're talking about this a long time past and we know more than Mary Shelley knew, but if Winsey is indeed aging, and I know I'm going a little bit down the rabbit hole scientifically, and he's 323 years old, your mind starts breaking down at 80, 90, 100. My grandmother lived to be almost 100 years old, and she had no clue who I was. Her mind was gone. You lose that. So if Winsey is 323 years old, there's probably no way that he reliably, that's important, remembers his wife. He's forgotten her. So how can we trust his story? How can we trust his love? What he really remembers genuinely? Think of it 1,000 years. Think of 1,000 years ago. Imagine that right now. The year is 2024. In the year 1024, our world was completely different. Imagine what it will look like in the year 3024, when we indeed have flying vehicles and teleportation and wireless electricity and have superpowers. Imagine you lived through all of that. There's no way, I think, that you could genuinely remember what it was like in your life, or the people in your life, more importantly, in the year 2024.
I remember like going through sales training. I don't know. I mean, you've worked in sales, so I don't know how much training or what training you had in that. But they say it doesn't matter what the person thinks. What matters is how they feel. How did they feel about the product? How did they feel about you? Like the emotions a lot of time are what drive our actions, drive our sales, right? And such. And if we can rely on Winsey, what drives Bertha to change if she really did change? She says, "Take me to poverty and happiness," right? And assuming she actually did say that, right? If we're relying on him on some level, and that he's not, because it could be, to your point, Winsey was projecting, like that's what he wanted her to say, and like maybe it was something a little bit different. But let's say that she's like, you know what, money doesn't buy happiness, right? What makes happiness is giving up everything you have, giving up obsession with money, right? Like there's that statement of it's easier to pass like the camel through the needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven, right? This man Winsey gave up so many years of his life to try to get wealth, but I think it was for a good intention, to get Bertha, but at what cost, right? And same thing with her. She spent so many years under the protectress, but at what cost? It kept a barrier between her and happiness, essentially, right? So how do you know what's truly going to make you happy? Because we all think money's going to do it. We all think, right? Like, oh, I'll just work those extra 10 hours. Like, you talk to some people now, they're working like 60, 80 hours a week. Like, that's heartbreaking. Think about doubling your work life from the traditional 40 hours is what we're told when we're growing up, right? And that you now have to work 70, 80 hours a week, right? You are doubling the amount of time at work as opposed to doing what you want, like actually looking for whatever it is that would give you happiness. And isn't that like, I don't want to like come down, because some people are doing it, like single mothers trying to raise like 3 kids. Like it's not a choice that they do that a lot of times, but think about what they're giving up and sacrificing for others, in the same way that like what Winsey was willing to go to. And his sacrifice tends to be very painful, because now he has to live for eternity remembering Bertha in this way. It's a complex, I think, story about sacrifice, visions, long-term consequences, essentially.
And self-destruction. And I think that in a twisted kind of way, and again, I'm not trying to judge anybody for having to take care of their family, as Una said, but you could view it as self-destruction. Having to work that many hours is destroying yourself for love. And that's what Winsey has done. Mm-hmm. Is he's sacrificed himself for something that he feels is more important. In the end, did it matter? Did it matter? Because he's the one still suffering all these hundreds of years later.
Well, remember, there's even that quote. Well, there's even that quote where she said, the narrative said her jealousy never slept. Right. So even if you prosper, the love of your life might suffer because of your accomplishments sometimes.
I mean, it's those internal struggles, right, that we all have. And it's what my wife tells me all the time. It's that illusion that communication has happened. And had they communicated, I don't think we would have ended up where we were. And maybe that's what Mary Shelley's trying to tell us, is that communication is what needs to happen in order for people to truly realize what somebody wants, to make them happy. Ask them, communicate, talk. And that's the point of why we created this channel, is to have more discourse. Have those conversations, have those tough conversations, please, so that you don't end up like Winsey hundreds of years later without the people that you truly love.
Mm-hmm. Now, full respect to Mary Shelley in the story. Like, it's great. And I also think this is a very common thought for a lot of people. Like, would you actually want immortality if other people didn't have it? Because we see that with the vampire stories too, right? The vampire falls in love with a human. The human's going to die. Vampire has to make a choice as to whether he's going to grant immortality to the human. You can't tell me you've never heard that story before. I digress. Point being, it's a common question. We have to ask ourselves, if we were immortal, is it better to give that gift to someone, or is it better to come to grips with the finite, to come to grips with loss and meaning over time? And I think that's a hard question.
It's interesting. The word that you used there was gift and not curse, because I think Winsey would disagree with you and say that it was a curse, not a gift.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something to contemplate.
No. You're absolutely right. Call me out there. Let me, one more question, if I may. Would you want immortality?
1000%. Yes. Yeah.
Because
if I see the lights go out in the universe in 100 billion years, as much as I love my wife, as much as I love you, as much as I love our viewers, in a million years, I would forget about you. I would not be able to remember you. And that's heartbreaking, but it's true. But to be able to see the things, is it worth the sacrifice? I want to say yes. I mean, I joke about it, but I don't know. Probably not. It's a tough question. And I think that's one that humanity has struggled with our entire existence and will continue to, because our mortality is something that is precious, right? It is something that defines us as people.
No, and when we lost my grandma a year or half ago, I went to go see my sister this past weekend. She still holds on to all these little tchotchkes, little acorn that she's put out for fall. Now that it's Halloween, we were up there. She had grandma's, little fall wreath up and such. And at some point, like, material things get broken, they get lost, they get destroyed. Let's say you're immortal. Eventually that goes away. Memory starts to fade. Our value of the past fades away. Like, that is a heuristic of humanity. At some point, are you able to let go? And like, that is just, I can't understand that, because all I know and am told is about having a finite life. So the infinite is it just doesn't even seem possible to me.
Unfathomable, right?
It does.
Yeah.
Letting the sun go down on the universe was kind of a beautiful poetic way for me to think about, what would that mean? So I don't know. Let us know in the comments down below what you viewers out there have, really resonated with the story. Would you accept immortality? Why or why not? Let me know in the comments. Mary Shelley playlist down below. Thank you for spending time with us today. My name's been Una. Peace.
Thank you for giving us your time. We know it's finite. Peace.